For more on this, I'm joined by Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas, and David Cay Johnston, who is a former New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Thank you both for joining us today on the program.
Thanks, Katerina.
So we're going to start with Greg first, Mr. Greg Swenson. So we're seeing new reports today that President Trump has actually shifted his tone on the immigration crackdown in Minnesota, including what he called a very good call with Governor Tim Walz. So walk us through what's actually been agreed to here and what Minnesotans should actually expect in the coming days.
Well, there wasn't much detail on what they specifically discussed. He just said it was productive, and he also had a phone call with the mayor of Minneapolis, Mayor Fry. So, I think this is progress. I think it's actually a great pivot by the president to reach out, and perhaps he did it earlier in his second term. I don't know that, but it's sort of, I would argue, overdue, because what's really important in this situation is cooperation from state and local government. There's been many more deportations, 10 times more deportations, for example, in Texas at about 30,000 than in Minneapolis. There are 10,000 deportations in Florida, and yet there's no protest, there's no friction, but it comes with cooperation from local government. So I think it's really important that they work together on this.
Exactly. Cooperation, I think, has been the big word here. And we're also seeing that the White House and Trump is now facing bipartisan criticism here after federal ICE agents fatally shot a second U.S. citizen in just a matter of weeks. Even more and more Republicans, for example, are calling for an investigation into Alex Pretti's death. Does this moment mark a turning point for President Trump with parts of his support base here?
No, I don't think so. I think, if anything, the criticism was that the Department of Homeland Security came out of the gates too quickly and made some comments about the tragic accident, or whatever you want to call it, the tragic situation on Saturday. And I don't think they had all the facts. I think they were a little aggressive, and that's what pushed back some of the Republicans to suggest that, let's have an investigation first and then make your comments.
And there's been some pushback on the administration's early description of Alex Pretti as a terrorist. What's your take here, Greg? Was it appropriate to frame the situation as domestic terrorism?
Well, I don't think so. I think, if anything, it's too early, especially before they really knew anything about about the victim. And so I think it's just wise to let the investigation play out. Yes, there are domestic terrorists in Minneapolis. Yes, there are organized. These are not organic protests. They're organized, in many ways, insurrections, or at the very least, obstructionist. So these are professional agitators that are trying to stop federal law enforcement. And so, this is very troubling, but it doesn't mean that everyone involved some of them are innocent victims that are just recruited on these signal chats, or they're somehow manipulated into these protests. And again, peaceful protesting is fine. And if that was their intention, great. But if you start obstructing federal agents and using violence, then I think that's where it gets problematic. So I would hope that that they dial down the rhetoric, but find these organized Antifa groups, same ones that were there in 2020 after the George Floyd fentanyl overdose, and that was Antifa and BLM. They're using the same tactics and probably many of the same people. So I hope they get to those people. That doesn't necessarily mean that the shooting victim was one of them, but he was obstructing at that time.
David, what's your opinion on the matter? You've written extensively about Donald Trump, and you've also studied law enforcement tactics. So what's your take here? Do you think that Pretti was obstructing law enforcement here?
Not in any way. The video is quite clear that these were officers who were escalating rather than de-escalating, and we've seen throughout bad tactics. And there have been a number of police officers who now teach criminal justice, as I do, on TV and radio in America, taking apart image by image what happened here. I would expect that the state government or Hennepin County District Attorney will prosecute the shooters and that they will be convicted and sent to prison. This was murder. This was not proper police tactics. The nurse went to help a woman who was gratuitously thrown to the ground by ICE officers who crossed the street to reach her. And after the gun that he legally carried under his coat and therefore inaccessible was removed by one of the ICE officers, that's when he got shot, when he was no longer a danger to anyone. He was on the ground. He was covered by officers. So this is a very serious matter. And Trump is getting pushback for the first time, serious pushback from brand name Republicans who are as appalled as I think every decent person is over seeing law enforcement gratuitously murder a nurse who went to help a woman who'd been pushed to the ground.
And David, you take me to my next question here because you mentioned persecution. So how about the federal ICE and Border Patrol agents that were involved here in this Alex Pretti situation and shooting? Do you believe their actions were lawful? They say that Pretti posed an immediate threat when shots were fired.
Right. Well, the video shows very clearly that that is simply a lie. It is not true. And we've seen throughout that the Trump administration has jumped ahead and issued false statements. For example, the Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said he brandished a weapon, which is an absolute lie. So what you're seeing now is Donald, who is in feral mode. He recognizes that he has brand name Republicans criticizing what he's doing because he's the one who's authorized these aggressive tactics. And Donald is now trying to find some way to back off from this, blame others, insist, you will hear him insist before long, this was not what I wanted. Because it's Donald's nature when he falls into feral mode to blame everybody else and never take responsibility himself.
And here's a question for the both of you. Let's start here with Greg, because as a result of all this, Donald Trump is actually reshuffling his Minnesota operation. So President Trump is now sending Tom Homan, who is the so-called border Czar, to take the lead here. Who is Tom Homan? And do you think, Greg, that this was for the best?
Yes, I think it's a great idea because I think Kristi Noem was, went out of the gates a little bit too quickly without getting the details with some of those comments and some of those statements. And so Tom Homan has been in this business for a long time, this specifically in immigration enforcement. So he worked for President Obama. President Obama gave him a Congressional Medal of Honor. I think that was the specific title, but a medal for his service. And of course, President Obama had 1.8 million evictions during his 2 terms. And so I think it's important to note that, Tom is a seasoned professional here. He's tough. He's not soft on crime. He's not soft on immigration crime. But I do think, he's better suited to handle things on the ground in Minneapolis. And again, he worked for, a Democrat president. And I would also note that during that time, President Obama had much better cooperation from the state and local government, whereas President Trump is getting that in most states, but not in Illinois, not in New York, not in Minnesota. And that's where, there's been 175 incidents of violence against ICE, against federal agents, federal law enforcement officers. And, of those, 74 of those were in just 4 cities, starting with Minneapolis and New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So, most of the violence against ICE is in these are in these blue states, blue cities that are also sanctuary cities. So I think Tom Homan will bring some calm to the situation, hopefully work with state and local government and get them involved, because that's really what we need in Minneapolis is support, not an adversarial position from state and local police.
And David, what's your take on this? How do you expect Tom Homan's approach to actually differ from outgoing immigration chief Greg Bovino? Because Greg, you mentioned that Tom was tough, but from what I saw, I think Greg Bovino was actually also pretty tough here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Well,
There's
Commander
no doubt
Bovino,
about that,
who has been wearing great coats, very reminiscent of Nazi SS officers, and making statements that anyone who questions what they do if you're a journalist is a so-called journalist, and generally attacking people, and raising this red herring, as your other guest has, of professional protesters. Getting him out of there is important to lowering the heat, and Homan will be better than Bovino. But keep in mind that people are turning out in the streets because ICE is not arresting, as Trump promised, the worst of the worst. They are arresting and putting in handcuffs 2-year-old children, 5-year-old children, teenagers walking to school. They have smashed windows on cars and businesses. They have entered homes without a warrant, which violates the Fourth Amendment. And I would expect as a Republican that your other guest would say that's abhorrent and needs to stop yesterday. So the reason people are turning out in these locations, which have very little crime, Minneapolis is a city of almost 500,000 people. It only has 600 police officers because there is so little crime. In fact, of the 3 homicides this year so far in Minneapolis, 2 of them were by ICE and Border Patrol agents. There'd be 1 homicide but for the federal government.
And this case on another debate has also reignited the debate over the Second Amendment. So gun ownership is legal in Minnesota, and carrying a weapon, to my knowledge, was not illegal here. So, Greg, what's your take on how the Second Amendment is being used here? Do you think it's actually being misused?
Well, I'm glad to see Democrats fighting for the Second Amendment. That's refreshing. And so, but look, if you have a concealed handgun license, you're required to do training for that. One of the requirements in training, or maybe the first rule in the training, is that if you're engaged with police, you have to indicate that you have a weapon on you and show them your license. So I don't believe that he was carrying a license. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I've read that. But surely there were mistakes made on both sides, and it's again a tragic situation. I think the hyperbole doesn't help. There was this story about the 5-year-old that went around left-leaning media a few weeks ago. No, the 5-year-old was not handcuffed. The father abandoned the 5-year-old when he was solicited by ICE for a warrant for his arrest. He abandoned the 5-year-old, and they looked after the 5-year-old. I don't know how that story got twisted into, ICE is going after 5-year-olds.
That's it for now. David Cay Johnston, a former New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and Greg Swenson, chair of Republicans Overseas. Thank you both for joining us today.